Independent Sage releases 2 new reports, one on vaccines and the need to maintain protective behaviours during their rollout, and the other one about halting the geographic spread of COVID-19 through tighter border controls. Both of those reports, including all the previous ones as well, can be read in full on our website. And Professor Gabriel Scally is going to say a few words about the report on border controls a little later today. And we'll also hear from Professor Stephen Reicher on the Safe Schools report that was published last week as well. Also in today's session, we're going to be hearing from 3 special guests, Hood, Alma and Noah, who will be talking about the impact that the pandemic is having on their lives and the mental health of young people generally. But first, as usual, we start with the latest facts and figures collated and analysed by Professor Christina Pargle. Christina, over to you.
Hello. Right, so this week there is some good news and some bad news, but I guess that's better than all bad news. So I'll be going through in a bit less detail than last week, because we went, last week was quite a detailed dive in, looking at cases, hospitalizations, deaths. And then I'm just going to spend a little bit of time looking at age breakdown, because it really matters if we're thinking about the difference between case numbers, the impact on hospitals, and also the vaccination strategy, and then end up by looking at the vaccination data. So, and also the ONS infection survey is late reporting this week, so it's not included in today's slides. Cases, so this is the number of confirmed cases by reported dates, people who've had a positive test. So as you can see, since last week, cases have come down across the UK. This is a good thing. The only thing here is over the last 3 days, they have gone up. So I'm hoping that's just the blip, but it's possible that the reduction is slowing a week after people kind of have gone back to work if they can't work at home, and also some schools are open. So it's something definitely to keep an eye on as we go into next week. This is percentage positivity, which is a better measure right now, just because the testing, the actual case numbers are all a bit messed up still from New Year. So this is the percentage of people who test positive. And you can see in every single nation, that's coming down. It's coming down a lot in Wales and Northern Ireland. This is really good news, particularly as both countries had like a really severe spike over Christmas. But basically the trend is a positive one. And also we're seeing in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland that all the regions are coming down, that it's not a kind of a regional effect, that it's coming down across the board. If we look at regions in England, just the positivity rate, compared to last week when everything was going up, this week, most places are going down. And again, this is good news, particularly you can see large drops in London, east of England and the southeast, which is good news. You'd kind of expect it because they've been in tier 4 since, well, 4 weeks now. And tier 4 over the holiday period when schools and workplaces are shut is effectively locked down. So, you'd hope that this is coming down, and it is. West Midlands, the Northwest and the Southwest have not moved. And that is concerning, but hopefully that will start coming down next week. This is just looking at case rates by age from Public Health England weekly report that came out yesterday. And you can see quite sharp decreases in almost every single age range over the last week, except this line here, which is the over 80s. And this is concerning because this is exactly the population that is firstly most likely to need hospital and most likely to die from COVID, but also the population that's being prioritized for vaccination. And if we keep going in the Public Health England report, this is outbreaks in care homes. And you can see again that the outbreaks of COVID in care homes are going up, and going up quite a lot since Christmas. And what I'm looking at here is wondering whether we're actually seeing some sort of Christmas effect. People were allowed to go and visit loved ones at Christmas in care homes. One of the things they did to check you could was use lateral flow tests, which should not be used, should never have been used to say you were safe to see people. over 15% of 85+-year-olds live in a care home. And also at Christmas, we know that there was more mixing among generations. So we don't know that, it might not be Christmas, it might be something else, but nonetheless, cases are going up in care homes, cases are going up in the over 80s. In workplace settings, you can see there was a big increase the last week as people have gone back to work. Next week, we should have good ONS data on the proportion of people going to work compared to the first lockdown that we had in March. But again, this is something that is a bit concerning because we do not want people having to go to work to keep transmission going in the community. In schools, you can see pretty much no outbreaks last week, which is good, and you kind of expect that since they were either closed or much emptier than normal. But we know that they're not as empty as they were. Schools are not as empty as they were in the first wave, so we kind of have to keep an eye on whether that's going to continue. However, outbreaks in nurseries have remained the same as they were in December, and that's a sign, that nurseries are still opening, and that is still happening. And finally, just one more school slide, partly because we've got some young people talking about their experiences later, but we can see in London at the end of December, this is the last week of term here, just quite how many people had to go off because of COVID. This is when when COVID is running rampant through your community, you cannot have a normal school experience. So looking at hospitalizations, this is the number of people in hospital per million people for the UK nations, and this is still going up quite steeply in England, and that will take a few more days. It takes longer for that to come down than it does in new cases. Wales, England, and Northern Ireland are all about double where they were in the first wave, so in much higher. Scotland is a bit higher, but it is higher now than the first wave. And admissions to hospital are still going up. We had over 4,000 people admitted in England on the 12th of January, which is 1,000 more people than we had at the peak in April. And we are now at the situation where we've had significantly more people admitted to hospital in the second wave than we did in the first wave. And 100,000 of those have been since the 1st of December. So you can see that's, from here onwards, just this incredible increase in the number of people needing hospital for COVID. Looking at hospital admissions by region, everywhere, pretty much everywhere is going up. London is the exception where you can see that perhaps it's starting to plateau, but it's certainly not coming down quickly. And the southeast potentially also, but the Midlands and Northwest are rising really fast. The Northeast is rising, the Southwest is going up very fast. So this is a problem. This is going to cause a problem for the NHS. So don't think that because cases are coming down, things are okay. And particularly in London and the east of England, even though we're now 4 weeks into a kind of lockdown, this is when tier 4 started, and cases are coming down and admissions maybe have plateaued. Critical care occupancy in these regions is double what it normally is, what it was last year. It's higher than it was in the first wave. Hospital occupancy is 50% higher than it was in the first wave. And this is in an area that was really badly hit in March and April. And it is taking longer to come down than it is then. So the pressure on hospital systems right now is just immense. So we just have to do everything we can to kind of keep cases coming down, because it is, I hear this from lots of friends who are working in the NHS, it's hell right now in hospitals, not just for staff, but also for families who are in hospital or whose loved ones are in hospital. Looking at death data, this is the ONS registered data to the 1st of January. This is always quite lagged. So even, so it's gone up a bit here, up to the 1st of January. But we know, you've seen the headlines that we've had record reporting over the last week. This will be going up now quite a bit over the next couple of weeks, unfortunately. This is the number of deaths within 28 days of a positive COVID test reported to the 14th of January. We hit almost 1,600 earlier this week. you can see just quite how steep this rise has been. I said last week we were soon going to exceed the first wave. We have now done that. We're at 44,500 deaths since September within 28 days of a test. Now, it's not exactly comparable because fewer people were getting tested in wave 1 than in wave 2, but it's nonetheless going to be higher than wave 1 on any measure by the time this is over. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about age. And I want to talk about how it plays a role in infection, hospitalization, death, and vaccination. And this is all using data since October this year. So this is kind of your general population, the proportion of people in each of the age brackets in the general population in England. So you have quite a few kids, then you have loads of young adults, loads of slightly older adults, and then people over retirement age here. And when it comes to getting COVID, it's not quite the same. So very young children are less likely to get it. This is confirmed cases. School-age children do get it, but they're less likely to be symptomatic as well. So they're less likely to be picked up as a confirmed case. But the majority of cases are in working age adults. And the older population are less likely to get it because they're less exposed to COVID, often because they're not in the workplace. And shielding, a lot of people have been shielding. But when it comes to going into, okay, so this is, the current vaccination policy is to try and vaccinate everyone over 70 by the middle of February. And that is not going to stop COVID circulating in our community. It doesn't mean that COVID can't keep spreading, and it doesn't mean that it can't keep mutating. So we can't rely on vaccination to bring cases down in our community. What it is important for is hospital admission. So you can see here quite how many more people in hospital are from these older age groups. And so by vaccinating effectively all of this group and some of the yellow group, you are going to significantly relieve pressure on hospitals, but it's not going to kick in until February. You're not going to start seeing that impact on hospitals until February. So January is still really difficult, but that is a really important part of vaccination. However, when it comes to intensive care, the population gets younger again. And that's because in general, fewer people over 80 go to intensive care because they won't benefit, because it's a really, really burdensome thing to put you through intensive care and a breathing machine. And so a lot of the time, people who are over a certain age or certain frailty won't go there because the chances are that they just won't make it. It's very high mortality rates. And so when it comes to relieving pressure on intensive care, which is currently really struggling, vaccination is only going to do so much. It's not going to stop any of these people needing intensive care. So again, we need to get cases down, and we cannot rely on vaccination to do that for us. But when it comes to deaths, again, you can see it is really, really skewed towards these older age groups. So it is true that by vaccinating these age groups, we will prevent a large death burden in our population. And that is a good thing, any way you look at it. So finally, just looking at the vaccination data, this is good news. We now have vaccinated over 35% of over 80s in the country. You can see in the last week, we had a big increase, almost 1 million people were vaccinated. They've only just started publishing daily figures, but the most recent day, 30th of January, they vaccinated almost 300,000 people. So it does look like we're on track to vaccinate 2 million people a week. So that is good news. The only slightly concerning thing that came out this week with the publication of NHS data is that the lowest rate of vaccinating the over 80s was in London in the east of England, which is exactly where cases were highest. So this seems like a mismatch. But Sadiq Khan tweeted yesterday that he raised this, and apparently they are now trying to increase vaccination in London and the east of England to try and combat this discrepancy. So just to finalise, summarise, case numbers and positivity rates are now falling in all nations. This is good news, but hospitals remain under enormous pressure, and it is still getting worse. We still haven't reached the peak. It will hopefully ease over the coming weeks as long as case numbers keep falling. Deaths will continue to increase for at least a few more weeks. So lockdown is working. Cases are coming down, but not well enough yet. They're not coming down that fast, and it's possible, we saw just the last few days kind of either stabilizing or going up, the cases will plateau at a high level, and that's not sustainable. And we have to get cases down as fast as possible, given both the pressure on hospitals, which is just immense, and the availability of vaccines. We have to protect people. So we know we can, so we have to kind of get cases down so that they don't get COVID before they can get vaccinated. And we need to start planning for spring and summer now. You know, how are we going to keep cases low? How are we going to stop new variants coming in, either arising in England or coming in from elsewhere? And with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much for that, Christina. Before we open up to questions, Professor Gabriel Scally is going to talk about the new report about the need for border controls. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you very much. This is an extremely important issue, and it is one that has been woefully neglected by our government. The absence of a strategy, in fact, for dealing with COVID-19 is a major, major concern. If I was to categorize or to summarize what a strategy would look like in terms of the virus, it would be get it down, and keep it out. We've dealt many times about how to get it down, about how to keep it down, and I want to address today the really important issue about keeping it out. And the real reason why it's so important now, of all times, is because of the development of variants in the virus. We know as the virus continues to spread across the world and replicate across the world that more variants will appear, and some of them may have characteristics that are really, really dangerous and unhelpful, such as increased transmission, but also it may even enable the virus to escape the beneficial effects of the vaccination program. So it is in everyone's interest to keep variants from moving across the globe. Just as it has been in the past, in everyone's interest to stop the virus being transmitted. That's how it came to this country, to these islands, by international transportation, by people who are the only real carrier of it. And Britain and Ireland are almost unique in the world in never really having had good public health controls on our borders, on our ports, on our airports to keep the virus out. So what we are proposing today is we're putting forward a paper which proposes to change the nature of the restrictions. We have had restrictions, of course. They have consisted mostly of self-isolation and a requirement on arrivals to self-isolate. But we know, and the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee produced an excellent report showing how little observed this was and how little enforced it was. And it is essentially a voluntary system of self-isolation that we know hasn't worked. And now is the time to replace it with a proper system. And we're advocating the system of managed isolation so that people, when they arrive, they will apply in advance when they're coming to the country, and will be provided with managed isolation facilities on arrival to ensure that by the time they leave those managed isolation facilities, they are no risk of importing the virus. Other places have done this, of course, from the beginning, and many places have taken advantage of their island status to use that to keep the virus out, and that is something that should apply both to Britain and Ireland, and countries like New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan have all and many others have all used that very, very successfully. And it's now our turn to use that island advantage and use it properly. One of the things that has been disturbing, I think, is even though we had this self-isolation system, we also have had a huge number of exemptions from it. I read a list of 58 different exemptions from it that many people are not aware of. Exemptions for business people with certain qualifications in terms of the size of their businesses or the contracts that they're handling. Exemptions for a wide range of people involved in media and television production and journalism. People who are running or participating in clinical trials and research, and a huge number of different categories. And we need to change this system and make it much, much tighter in order to try and stop the spread of the virus. We also need to take advantage of halting geographical spread within our countries by within our countries in these islands by putting in place arrangements to stop spread, whether between counties or between regions in the UK. And we have not done that to any noticeable extent or with any success. I sometimes categorize this as we're very busy at the moment trying to mop up the floor and keep people safe from the virus and help people who've got it already and are become ill. But what we haven't got round to doing is fixing the hole in the roof where the new cases are coming in. And this is our chance to do it. So as part of this very brief strategy of get it down and keep it out, the keep it out bit, we are putting forward proposals today, and I commend them to you. And as ever with Independence Age, when we put one of these documents out, we very much hope to have your comments on it and your suggestions on it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And now it is time for questions. We want to fit in as many as possible. So please keep your questions succinct and single. And I know the panel will be concise and precise as usual. The first question comes from Nigel Nelson, who is political editor at the Sunday People. Nigel Nelson.
To go back next month as planned, does that mean that teachers must be vaccinated before they do so?
Thank you, Nigel. We just missed the very beginning of your question there. Was that about schools going back?
That's right. The fact that schools will go back, are planning to go back next month. To do so, does that mean teachers need to be vaccinated before they do?
Thank you very much. Who would like to start with that one? Do we need to vaccinate teachers before schools open? Dr. Zubaida Haque.
Well, I'll leave the question about whether we vaccinate teachers or not in terms of the clinical stuff to my colleagues. But what I want to say, Nigel, is that vaccination should be just one step of how we protect teachers and how we make schools safer. How we make schools safer is actually the bigger and more important question. And at the moment, there is no clear answer to that from government. At the moment, it seems that the only answer is mass testing. And there are so many issues around mass testing, lateral flow tests, as we've heard. We've heard that the MHRA has just said no, that they will not authorize mass testing in schools. So actually vaccinations is just one issue. The most important issue is how do we make schools safe? And DfE have done nothing around that.
Thank you very much. Professor Dinan Pillay, you'd like to comment here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I think the answer is yes. I think, we need to, given that there's a scale up and rollout of vaccines, of course, there's a prioritization that has been based on clinical need. But in effect, schools are essential for our children to be educated, as we all agree. And we need to do our utmost to reassure those people who are running schools, which of course include staff within the schools, not only teachers, but all the other staff, catering staff, administrative staff, cleaning staff. They are vulnerable. And I would fully support an immunization program that included them as, of course, key workers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dinan. So, two very important points there. First of all, focusing on the teachers and their rights as employees and their needs as key workers. But as Zubaida said, also focusing on the fact that schools are part of a community and there need to be a lot of other measures in place to make them safer. The next question comes from Robert Bourne, who is Assistant National Officer for Health and Safety for Unison. Robert. Are you there,
thank you, Alice. Yeah, I was very interested in Christina's presentation, which showed increasing infection rates in workplaces, and that reflects my own experiences with increasing members reporting anxiety about going into work where colleagues have been infected, and this isn't just schools. that's health and social care, which is one that's hitting the headlines, but also other areas such as refuse services. Does the panel think there are any areas regarding workplace guidance which could be tightened up, both in terms of safety measures to keep workers safe, but also who and when should actually be going into work?
Thank you very much, Robert. Who would like to start with that on workplace guidance, health and safety? Professor Susan Mickey.
Well, thank you for a very important question. And I actually can't comment on the guidance itself, but I will say a couple of things. First of all, there's an issue about which workplaces should be open at the moment. When we look at the figures, when we look at the forecast, when we look at the crisis in the NHS and the impact it's having on our healthcare workers, it's obvious we need to do absolutely everything we can to bring this infection rate down as quickly as possible. That means restricting the contact people have with each other. And there are many non-essential workplaces open in England. Scotland, I'm really pleased to say, has tightened them, but England has many non-essential workplaces open where people are coming into contact with each other and infecting each other. And the other problem is that in order to get to workplaces, people are on crowded tubes and buses in the cities. So one obvious thing is fewer workplaces should be opened. Another thing that's very clear is that not most workplaces don't have any systematic way of being inspected. So whatever the guidance is, who knows whether the guidance is being followed? It seems to me that a lot of the responsibility has been put on employers to say, is this essential or non-essential? And also putting on employers to say, do I think this is safe or not safe? And we know from history that this isn't good enough and this won't result in safe workplaces. I don't know if any of my other colleagues can say anything more specific about the nature of the guidance itself.
Dr. Kit Yates, you'd like to say something here?
I was unfortunately not going to speak specifically about guidance, but I was going to sound like a broken record and suggest that one thing which would help to make workplaces safe is support for isolation. So when people get a positive test result, they don't have to come into work and risk infecting their colleagues. They can stay at home. And we've seen some figures coming out this week suggesting that huge proportions of people who are applying for the measly £500 that's being offered are actually being rejected from that. And then what choice do they have about trying to keep their colleagues safe? So we bang on about it all the time, but I'm going to bang on that drum again. We need better, more easily accessible support for isolation.
Thank you very much, Kit. Professor Stephen Reicher.
I think there's a bit of a theme emerging here. On the one hand, we need to take adequate measures to stop the spread of infection, and clearly they aren't adequate. When last week in schools, children of so-called essential workers were allowed to go in many schools, that meant more than half of them, which meant that by the end of the week, the DfE had to change that guidance. But that broad definition of essential workers is still there, and there are still very large numbers of people going out, and most of the people on the streets are people going to work, not people breaking the rules, people obeying the rules. So we've got to have adequate action to bring infection down. But then, when we've brought the infection down, we've got to have changed something to keep infections down. And therefore, we need adequate action in schools, in workplaces, and in hospitality to ensure that there is safety. It's not good enough for the government to wave its hands and say to employers, you make it safe. There has to be systematic regulation, systematic certification, and systematic inspection to make sure our public spaces are safe. And if they are, then people will be more confident in going back to work, more confident in going into hospitality, and it will be easier to open up the economy.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Professor Martin McKee, you wanted to comment here. You're muted at the moment. That old trick.
Yeah, sorry, I was pressing the space bar, but it didn't work. I think this is yet another example of exposing the weaknesses in our safety nets in the country due to underinvestment in things over a long period of time. Because if we look at what's happening in other countries, the Nordic countries, Germany and elsewhere, where you have really strong occupational health and safety, environmental health infrastructure in place that can set standards, support people and work with employers and with trade unions to put all of the mechanisms in place, all the structures in place to achieve COVID secure workplaces. Unfortunately, we've lost an awful lot of those because those workforces, those organizations have been eroded over the past decade or so. So I think that's just a lesson, something to flag up as we try to quote unquote build back better to make sure that we try to restore some of those.
Thank you very much, Martin, and Robert, thank you for that question. We have time for a couple of questions now from members of the public, starting with Marcus in Aberdeenshire. Marcus.
Yeah.
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Good. Yeah, the question relates to an apparent lack of clinical diagnosis in the find effort of the fittest, mantra that you guys coined. Can you shed any light on that? Is there no value in clinical diagnosis as a kind of proactive way of tackling this?
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that question. So really, this does take us back to find, test, trace, isolate. Professor Gabriel Scally.
Good question. I think there's a huge role for clinical diagnosis. And in fact, one of the strange things I think has been the way in which the symptoms have been narrowed down. The known and talked about symptoms have been narrowed down in order to fit in an easy testing and tracing system. So it's been very restricted. And in fact, we know that the symptoms of COVID-19 are very varied indeed. The virus attacks all sorts of systems in the body and produces all sorts of symptoms. So I think clinical diagnosis has a real importance here. Of course, it's difficult to do that remotely, but I think doctors have responded really well to having to work clinically remotely. And I believe clinical diagnosis is very, very important. Clinical diagnosis, in my view, and the sort of the rubric, the internet checklist approach should work hand in hand and not seen as one as substitute for the other. And I particularly think of this is because different countries have chosen different lists of symptoms to tell the public when they need to get in touch and come forward for testing. And I particularly note that in Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, has a list of 4 symptoms, and the Republic of Ireland has 5 symptoms because they include shortness of breath. And for some reason, shortness of breath is not one of the symptoms in that classic group of symptoms that used for the public-facing material around testing in the UK. So that's just an example of how important clinical diagnosis is, in my view. How to make it operational is, of course, another issue. And we're still seeing new reports appearing of new symptoms of COVID-19 as we learn more about the virus and its effects. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Anthony, I think you wanted to speak as well, Professor Anthony Costello.
WHO made it very clear almost a year ago that to suppress this virus, you have to find cases. And you can do that by clinical means, or you can test, or do both. And it was a key success criterion last January and February when the Asian states suppressed it. Now, our government does not believe in this. The select committee last week, a woman from Public Health England said that the policy was focused immunization of old people and let young people then go get it because it isn't very serious. That was the quote. And the Great Barrington Declaration people tweeted this and said, yeah, we agree with this, it's very good. And I think that has been our government policy. They say it's not about herd immunity, but last March, the chief scientific advisor and medical officer said, we can't suppress it, we need people to get it, we'll build herd immunity. And I've heard nothing since that persuades me they have changed that view. Indeed, SAGE backed this up last March by unanimously agreeing. They said, well, China will inevitably get a second surge, even if they've temporarily suppressed it. Well, China last week did have a new outbreak, okay, they're running at 3 per million deaths. Some of the other Asian states are less than that. The UK is running at nearly 1,300 per million deaths. And what did China do when they had an outbreak? They had 100 cases in a day. We're at 40,000 plus, as Christina has shown. And what did China do? They've locked down 23 million people. They've done mass testing, intense contact tracing, isolation, and travel bans, and they'll crush it. We had the wrong strategy. We still do. Failure to suppress this virus is causing cases, deaths, hospital admissions, economic disaster, mutations, variants, more debt, more recession, fewer jobs. We've got the wrong strategy.
Thank you, Anthony. Martin, I know that you wanted to say something here as well, Professor Martin McKee.
Well, very briefly on diagnostic awareness, I think we shouldn't forget long COVID, because I think we're hearing too many examples of people who are suffering from this, who are struggling to be heard and struggling to have diagnoses made. So I think as a physician myself, I think we need to make sure that all of our colleagues are aware and understand the complex spectrum of this really quite debilitating condition.
Thank you very much, Martin, on that need to think about the chronic impact as well as the acute situation there. Moving on to another question then from the public, a member of the public, Louise Flanagan in Cambridgeshire. Louise.
Hello. My question's about children. I'm wondering if they're going to be left to be reinfected continuously by COVID, as the government seem intent that we're not going to go zero COVID, or is there a vaccine being developed for children that I'm just unaware of? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a question about vaccines specifically for children. Who would like to start with that one? Deanan.
Well, my understanding is that trials are ongoing in children. Of course, it's a very different regulatory environment with children. So, and we've got to make sure that vaccines are safe. But that's my understanding, is that these are ongoing. Having said that, it is, and despite our wish to move to zero COVID, we've got to also expect that this virus will hang around, and until it's eliminated from the whole world, we will all be at risk. And of course, we know that the other coronaviruses that do cause a common cold in children do come back every year or two for each child. Of course, it has minimal consequences, that particular virus, in terms of disease, and COVID-19 is of course far more serious. So I would hope that immunization does get extended to children, particularly if particularly with new variants, it becomes apparent that children are more of a conduit for infection to others, compared to the first variant, where it didn't seem so. So in other words, a little bit more like flu, where we know children are responsible for, or children harboring infection are responsible for passing it on to others. So I would hope there's progress in this field, but given the rapid speed of development of these current vaccines, I fear it'll be some time before we have vaccines that are fully approved for children.
Thank you very much, Deanan. And Martin, you had a comment.
Yeah, and Deanan will know more about this than I do, but there is some very early work looking at inhalational vaccines through using phages and other things, and that might, I suppose, potentially work a bit like the inhaled vaccines for influenza in children to perhaps prevent onward transmission. So, but that's really quite a way down the road.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question. I've got a question here to read out, sent in from Richard Harrison in Gloucestershire. He says, since international travel is back in the news, what is the Independent SAGE panel's view on the rational basis for reducing the quarantine period from 14 days to 10, given that the maximum incubation period is supposedly 14 days and the infectious period, which could be asymptomatic, is up to 10 days? What is the statistical analysis to demonstrate that the risk of infections, possibly with new variants outside the reduced quarantine period doesn't have a significant impact on containment or the overall R number. So what is the view then on reducing the quarantine period from 14 days to 10? Kit.
So am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
It's just not showing on my computer. So there have been a number of modelling studies which have been done taking into account the infectious period. They suggest that, as the question, as Richard suggests, that you can be infectious up to 14 days after being infected yourself. But that actually the probability, the infectious, your chance of infecting other people decreases the later you go. So reducing 10 from 14 days down to 10 days was a practical concern. It obviously then does increase the risk that people will be released from quarantine and potentially go on and infect other people, but that risk is relatively small. Really, though, I think we should be fighting for tougher strategies for people coming into the country overall. So we should be making sure that people take a test before they leave isolation. As Gabriel suggested in the border document, we should be having managed isolation so that it isn't effectively voluntary. It's actually mandatory. You have to go to a particular place and be monitored. Make sure you don't just get on public transport and go home and start doing whatever you want to do. It is good news that the government's brought in this test 72 hours before people come to Britain. But given that we've got this very infectious variant in the UK, we should be also making sure that people who are leaving the UK are also doing tests to make sure that they're not exporting this variant to other countries. That's the way that we are hopefully going to get out of this problem, is to make sure that people who move across borders from one country to another, across all countries, are not infectious and not bringing different strains from country to country. So the quarantine period reduction is a small aspect of how we manage our borders, and reducing it from 14 days to 10 days will potentially increase the proportion of people who go on and infect other people. But actually, there are loads of other things that we should be doing to try to make our borders more secure.
Thank you very much, Kit. Has anybody else got a burning desire to talk about quarantine periods, or whether we should be just as careful about exporting it as we are about importing it? Seems right, doesn't it? Seems ethical. Right. We'll now move on to a section on young people, and Professor Stephen Reicher is going to talk briefly about the new Safe Schools report, which was published last week with a view to making sure that schools are safe when they reopen. Stephen.
Well, as Christina has been telling us so eloquently and so powerfully in recent weeks, we are in the middle of a perfect storm. High initial rates of infection due to the failure to suppress the virus, which facilitated the emergence of new variants, which were more transmissible. And on top of that, regulations which allowed mixing over the Christmas period. As I say, we're in a perfect storm, and in a storm, you have to batten down all the hatches. And sadly, that includes schools. No one is happy. No one likely closes schools. We absolutely agree with the World Health Organization when it says that schools should be last to close and first to open. But it has been necessary to close schools. However, closing schools is not a strategy. Closing schools is an emergency reaction when you're in the midst of a crisis. What we need, and we've been saying this in virtually every area, is a strategy and a comprehensive strategy. And our paper tries to give such a strategy. And it adds two things to the closure of schools. The first thing, which we've been talking about since the autumn, is the need for schools to be safe. It's no good reopening schools if they then are a place in which the infection can spread all too easily, and sadly at the moment they are. Classrooms are crowded. Classes aren't particularly well ventilated. Masks for older pupils aren't being used, and that's got to change. When we look, for instance, at Denmark, which already had smaller class sizes than the UK, they hired extra teachers, hired extra spaces like museums and other municipal spaces that were closed, and their class sizes are about 10 to 12 people, where you can properly socially distance people. So we need safe schools so that when schools reopen, they don't lead to another spike in infections such that we then have to impose still further restrictions. And the other thing we have to do The other element of the strategy has got to be to address the harms done by school closure. And there are a number of such harms. One of those harms is, of course, to the education of children in the short term, especially poor children who don't have IT, who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't have the spaces in which to study. We need to do something about that. And then there are the long-term harms, the impact on people's future. And we need to think very carefully about transition over the next few years of young people into the world of work and the world of further and higher education, and what extra training, free training courses, free summer schools we need to do to give people those skills and that support. But the harm, which I want to focus on now, because that's what we're going to be talking about in a moment, is to mental health. We all know there is a harm to mental health to children. The president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists pointed out there's going to be a tsunami of mental health problems. 10 million people will need more help, 1.5 million children. Now, a lot of that is due to the pandemic itself, not to the closure of schools, but to the worries about the future, to the trauma of getting the disease or your parents getting the disease. But certainly isolation is part of it. 87% of young people feel isolated. Almost everybody. 69% of young people felt that their mental health was suffering when they went back to school, and yet there was less support than before the pandemic. More children were saying, we can't talk to anyone, that support isn't there. And therefore we need to, first of all, be open about this problem and you move it up the agenda. People are always saying mental health should be moved up the agenda. It never actually happens. This time it's got to happen. And we need to be thinking about the precise things we can help people with, not only strengthening mental health generally within the NHS, but thinking about how do we bring support into schools? How do we bring support into the workplace? So we need to know what the problems are, and we need to think about the solutions. An independent sage is here not just to tell people what should happen, but to listen to the people to whom things are happening, to learn from it, and to develop our policy accordingly, which is why I'm so delighted that we're going to have Hood, Alina, and Noah talking to us, and for us and you watching to learn from them.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now we are going to have a discussion with our three special guests who are going to share their own personal experiences of the pandemic and talk about the impact it's had on them. Hood, Alma and Noah are all involved with a project called Planet DVOC 91, which is a participatory art project set up last year to amplify the voices of young people. And they're working with acclaimed comic book creators, scientists, historians and academics. And what they're planning to make is a sci-fi webcomic aiming to explain the pandemic in an accessible way. So I'd like to invite Hood to speak first. Hood, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, my name is Hood Kazibwe. I'm 16 and I'm in college now. And I'd just like to talk about my experiences with COVID at the moment, especially from last year, because I was in high school last year. This is my first year of college. And in my high school, we had spent 5 years there since 2015. And we were, that was the longest school I was at compared to first school, primary. And you know, in those 5 years, you make all those friends, you create all those bonds and relationships with each other. And for it to be halted because of COVID, and I understand obviously the school made the right decision in halting going to school and sending us all home to self-isolate. We were given a 2-day warning, so it was quite a quick process. We were told during the week that we would be leaving the school, but then it got cut short, I think a day earlier. So we left on Thursday, but we were supposed to leave on Friday. And I understand why that would have been, because I wanted us to get into lockdown quicker. But the whole thing that we were going to do on Friday was like a send-off, because we were in year 11 and we were there for 5 years. So to have that send-off would have been a nice thing. And we would have all talked to each other, shared our experiences in the 5 years that we were at the school for. and that got cut short. We never did that. So I think what I'm trying to say is that, and and I think it does apply to most schools as well that had to leave abruptly because of COVID, that it does affect mental health, because when you're with all those people for so long and you make those relationships, those bonds with each other, and it gets cut short like that because of COVID. Like, for example, I made a lot of friends at the school, and we would walk to and from school all the time during those 5 years. Like, those are a lot of days, and it got cut off just like that. And I haven't seen them for a long time. And obviously I do talk to them online, but not in person. So that is like another thing that I feel that would affect a lot of people's mental health. So you're with someone for so long, and you're with each other, and because that is cut short, it will affect a lot of people in some different ways. And it did affect me a lot, because I had a lot of relationships and bonds with people that we had to kind of let go of in a way, because we haven't seen each other for so long. And I also feel that in lockdown at the moment, the way a lot of young people are getting their information with COVID is on social media, and a lot of people don't look at news outlets like Sky News and BBC, because they're a younger target audience, so they're more based on like Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and things like that. And I feel that maybe more work could be put into directing news, and legitimate news as well, and not news that may be false or confuse people, but helps people understand what COVID is about, what to do. And I think that because there's not a lot of that going on, that people are using social media, like people, news outlets like Sky, BBC, using that and taking that to advantage and trying to help younger people understand what's happening with COVID. I think that also is something that would affect mental health, because a lot of people do use social media, and the fact that bigger news outlets like Sky and BBC aren't taking advantage of that and using that as a way to connect with people and give them information that can help them and guide them is something that should definitely be looked at. And I also think that lastly, teachers as well maybe should be more supported in speaking to younger adults, younger children, what to do, where to guide them if they need support and struggling with mental health. And I think that's something that also needs to be looked at as well. But that's everything I have to say.
Thank you so much for that, Hood, for that really poignant, very personal insight and the way that you were wrenched out of your social circle and cut off from your friends by the pandemic. And I think a really interesting perspective on access to trustworthy news as well. I'm going to invite the panel for their responses in a moment, but first of all, we're going to hear from our next special guest, Alma. Alma.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
So, hi, my name's Alma. I'm 17 years old and I'm from Manchester. So I've been part of this project from the very start, and it's been a very rewarding kind of experience. And from all our interviews, we've actually come up with a few points that have been recurring, and that's mental health, stigmatization, and misinformation. So mental health, that's really impacted me personally in multiple ways. Firstly, I have an autistic brother, and it's been really difficult, with all the mental and physical impacts that has on him and on us as his family, as his carers. And unfortunately, there's not been a lot of government support for us at all, and any guidance, which has left us quite frustrated. And also in terms of my mental health, that's also decreased a lot in terms of like the uncertainties to do with exams and school life. I'm actually in year 13, and so I've been studying all this time, and then just having a couple of weeks ago, like exams are cancelled. That's been quite frustrating for me, because I feel like the governments are making all these decisions about my life and I've got no kind of say on it, which is really disheartening. And as Stephen mentioned before, there has been like little support for me and for lots of young adults in school and out of school, and this is something that I would really like to see change. And something that was mentioned earlier, which really I'd like to comment on is the fact that doctors and like those key workers also have mental health problems that are not being addressed. So I know this because my dad's a doctor, and his mental health has really been impacted from this pandemic. He's had no proper rest like from the start, and it's been really stressful. And this has really impacted me because the fact that he's going, like he has to do all these long hours and staying away from home a lot has meant that I've had to uptake more responsibility in terms of caring for my brother, and not getting to see my dad a lot, which is really, it's impacted me and my mental health negatively a lot. And something else I'd like to mention is misinformation. So this has been really prevalent in the social media, and there's been a lot of incidences about people spreading false information. So this information could be about COVID or about mental health and many other things. And it's quite detrimental because, especially for mental health, a lot of young people go online on social media to seek advice, and because there are people that are unqualified to give advice are giving these like comments, it can be quite detrimental for the people who do follow if it is like quite bad. And also something that you all mentioned was the importance of vaccines. So I think it's really interesting to see maybe the misinformation in regards to vaccines that's being posted online, and especially for young adults. I've been in many discussions about how people haven't been feeling like supportive of the vaccine because it's been like too fast and they're feeling a bit uneasy about it, and so it hasn't been looked at hasn't been really looked at positively, like from a young adult's perspective. So that might be interesting for all of you to note. So overall, like one observation that we've made is that no one's asking for our opinions on things that matter to us. And I think this really needs to change. So something that maybe I'd like to see is more opportunities for young people to share their views on the pandemic and on policies with researchers and the government via social media platforms. So our stories and our like perspectives are like kind of heard. And that could be really important because it could improve research and it could improve the policies being put forward, because it gives different perspectives on like whether we think they're effective or not in our kind of perspective. And also having a psychologist in the daily briefings, I think that's really important because mental health hasn't been talked about at all. And so like one step towards that would maybe be placing a psychologist up in the daily briefings and talking to the public and to communicate about how the pandemic has affected many people's mental healths and like the steps to kind of overcome that. So to conclude, there's a saying that I would like you all to remember, which is nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alma, and for taking this step to engage, to share your voice, to make your voice heard. Finally, then, before we open up for discussion, a word from Noah. Noah, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Noah. I'm 19 years old. I'm a transgender male that living in a YMCA property. So I am on here to obviously share my experience with the pandemic. There is a lot of assumption that young people have parents or guardians to rely on or to take care of them, and this is just simply not the case. So I've been living in the YMCA property since October of 2019, and I have had to decide whether to pay my rent or buy food. I've had to like not be able to buy stuff that I really need because of having to buy food. So there's just a big assumption that people have parents or guardians, and yes, people my age do have parents or guardians, but there are also a lot of people who are in similar situations as I am, that are just being completely overlooked, and we are falling through the cracks a lot. And as Alma said, no decisions without us, that kind of thing. A lot of research is on single families or families in general, and people who live on their own who are older, like 25, that kind of thing. A lot of my age bracket, so the YMCA is from 16 to 24-year-olds, and that's a big bracket of a lot of people who are living in situations where they have to fend for themselves. And for mental health, this has affected me massively. I have had mental health issues before COVID. So way before COVID, I've had mental health issues, and going into COVID and going into isolation and lockdown and stuff like that, it has taken a massive toll on my mental health. And I'm aware that a lot of people who didn't have previous mental health issues have developed mental health issues because of the isolation, because they're one reason or another, they might be on their own, or they might not be able to see an elderly relative or something like that. There's many different things that could contribute to mental health issues, but people with previous mental health issues that existed before COVID are completely just overlooked. A lot of people are researching about the depression or anxiety that has been raised since COVID has been around. And I would just like to, the reason why I'm here is I would like more done about young people's mental health and how, specifically how to support our mental health as young people, because there is a lot of, even previous to before COVID, a lot of mental health is overlooked. So it's not a new thing that mental health is overlooked, sadly. So basically it's just, how can you support somebody's mental health who are fending for themselves, who are having to do things for themselves that you wouldn't have previously had to do? How can we work together to support each other and our mental health through this? Speaking about the fact that it's a problem and is one thing, but how can we see more of that from professionals to young people who are suffering from mental health in this pandemic? So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Noah. Thank you, Hood and Alma. There's a huge amount to think about there, and it's incredibly valuable to hear from you today. So thank you for doing that. And I hope you'll stay around for a bit, because I'm sure that the panel would like to have a conversation with you rather than just respond. So I think, Stephen, you wanted to say a few words first, and then we'll just open up to a much more general conversation. Stephen. Oh, you're muted.
You'd think I'd have learned. I'm an old dog. I don't learn the new tricks. There's not much I want to say. I mean, I've been listening. I've been learning. I've been extremely moved, not least because I have a 16-year-old son who has been also affected by what's going on. So I see the realities of it. I think we are going to make mental health a focus for next week and bring in people to discuss in some ways what we can do. And I certainly think we need to develop policies. I hear three things from what has been said. The first is the importance of mental health, not only the impact of COVID on mental health, but the impact of having mental health difficulties on the experience of COVID, that both are extremely important and both need to be dealt with. I hear about the importance of support. And here, I mean, Gabriel was making the point earlier, one of the things that this pandemic has revealed is all the ways in which the breakdown of our public services have been revealed and led to even greater harms during this pandemic. And that's true of mental health as well. It seems that almost every Tuesday you hear a politician saying, we've got to take mental health more seriously, and then nothing happens. This week, incidentally, there was the launch of proposals for new mental health legislation. And one thing I learned, which amazed me, which showed not only how poor our provision is, but how outdated it is we still have legislation saying that if you're an unmarried woman, it is your father who will determine what happens to you in terms of mental health treatment. That's how bad a situation we are in. So clearly changes have got to be made. And the final point is in terms of voice. We have terms for it. We talk about co-creation and co-production, but nothing about us without us is a far, far better way of putting it. And it teaches us that language is important and that we learn not only about the realities, but the language we need to use. So thank you very much indeed. And this is just hopefully the beginning of a conversation and the beginning of our development of policy and proposals for the future.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Zubaida.
Those were incredibly powerful stories, Hood, Alba and Noah. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I am so angry on your behalf because I think a long time that young people have been overlooked and they've been at the brunt end of approach to schools. The government's approach to schools, as you know more clearly than us, has been chaotic, has been confusing, and worse, has been so last minute. We heard Hood talking about how with exams, they were, that you had no notice about exams, you had no notice to say goodbye to your friends. And we saw that even recently with BTEC exams, where the students didn't know from 2 weeks ago whether they were having exams that week or not. It makes me so angry. It makes me angry for you. It makes me angry for the teachers. And going back to the mental health issue, I absolutely agree. We absolutely need to have more support in schools, as well as for the government to think about what are they going to do for the spring break and the summer break in terms of opening up schools much more so that children don't just miss out on education, but also get the sort of social aspects, get to enjoy the social aspects of schooling as well as the psychological aspects of schooling, benefit from that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. Tallulah, you'd like to speak, and I think Carl would as well. So Tallulah.
Thanks, Alison. Thank you so much, Hood, Alma, and Noah. It's been really powerful hearing your experiences, and I think I join Zubaida in just being so frustrated and so angry on your behalf that, three key things that I see, I hear listening to you. The first is just how the real cost of this approach to not doing anything else except relying on repeated lockdowns, right? So, on one hand, the strategy seems to have been, oh, we just open up the economy, and then when we need to, we lock down, and we just open up and we lock down. But actually, what we're hearing from you and your experiences shows that real cost, that individual cost of doing that, and what happens when we let community transmission rife throughout, rather than keeping cases down. The second thing was hear from you really is, in as much as we talk about how schools are not separate from the community, is also important that we think about young people as not just about schooling, right? So the impact of the pandemic on young people is not just about schooling, because as you very powerfully describe the more holistic impact in terms of your choices about the hard choices around whether to eat or not, which is just disgraceful that that we have the situation, the impact on your family, the impact on your mental health. So really reframing what we're thinking about when we talk about young people, and not just equivocated with, okay, we mean schools, because that's not that's so incomplete. And the third thing really is about, and this picks up on what Zubaida says about thinking ahead, is thinking about the importance of thinking about schooling and education beyond schools in the very traditional sense of the word. So when we start thinking about what happens forwards in spring, in summer, in autumn even, how do we think about the role that schooling plays, particularly not just for education, but for mental health, for prospects, and how do we ensure in different scenarios, what happens if there's a new variant, what happens if we have to close borders, what happens if we have to close the school buildings, how do we actually protect those different outcomes? And picking up on your point, Alma, about nothing about us without us, I think it's really critical that in that imagining of what we should be thinking about how this pandemic impacts young people, it's, I think, really critical that you are actually drive that conversation. And so I talk about youth privileged perspective, not just youth driven or youth led, but actually your perspectives drive how we imagine what the options would be in spring and summer, because you have the best understanding of not just your educational outcomes, but a more holistic perspective. So I'm very hopeful, and I think we're also working on, as Indisage, thinking about advice around what happens down the line, say for summer. And so the really interesting, you've really got me thinking about how do we ensure that we have your perspectives in that, so that we're not just, again, saying things from our perspective. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Tallulah. Carl, Professor Carl Friston, you wanted to say something.
I did. So I also like this nothing about us without us notion. There's another little soundbite in academia, which is the pressure to change research into we-search. So I think there's a sentiment from the sort of academic side that this is this co-creation, this involvement is very important. But what I wanted to pick up on, I mean, clearly we are here to listen, and in that, I just want to reflect a couple of things. I actually pick up on something that both Tallulah and Zubaida mentioned, which is anger and frustration. It does strike me that a potentially useful metaphor for what we're all going through is a grief process. And the first part of grief after denial is anger. And of course, we're all grieving for something that we've all lost, which is a way of life and a way of being and a way of behaving. And that must be particularly acute for the age group, the students that we just heard talk about their experiences, in the sense that not only are they grieving for the normality that we all enjoyed a couple of years ago, but also they're moving into the unknown. They're leaving school, they're leaving the high school. So Hood's story about the cancelled, last opportunity to bring things to closure, to move ahead, I thought was particularly moving. That speaks to another big thing here, I think. Why do we grieve? Well, we have to readjust the way that we see ourselves and ourselves in relation to the world. And that entails a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty, I think, is what underwrites a lot of the mental health issues. And I was interested to note that nearly everybody was talking about misinformation. Of course, misinformation is the thing that that creates the uncertainty. And much of the drive to resolve that uncertainty is to seek out reliable information, to identify those bodies, institutions, people, friends, parents in whom you place epistemic trust. So it strikes me that one of the resolutions of the negative impact of mental health in getting us through this grieving process is the resolution of uncertainty. That probably has to come from the people seeking that information. So I want to say two things. First of all, very often as a psychiatrist, it's our job just to point out that the very process of talking about these things is actually an extremely effective and positive thing. And most of the heavy lifting in terms of the therapy, as it were, has actually been enacted by what we've just heard. So just exposing the perspectives of the students that we just heard, having them do that in such an honest and moving way, I think actually is not only putting that case forward to everybody listening on site, but also people watching the YouTube, thousands of people watching the YouTube afterwards. Also, I imagine that their project is establishing, if like, an independent sage for young people on Instagram. So I just want to ask them two things. Do they see themselves as putting together a resource that people of their age group can refer to that has established some epistemic trust? One, and two, I'd just like to ask them all, what did they see their lives being like, say, in a year's time? You know, how far does this uncertainty pervade? And you know, what kinds of pictures do they imagine that they will be? You know, what picture do they have of themselves? You know, in the long-term future? Because it must be awful if you just don't know what your life is going to be like, you know, next year, or indeed in the next few months.
Thank you, Carl. So I wonder, is Alma still with us? I can see that Noah and Hood are still there. I wonder, hello, Alma. You are all here then. I wonder if you'd like to comment back to Carl then, or respond to any of the comments.
Yeah. Well, for me, in terms of like the uncertainty, I actually applied for medicine this year, and so I would see myself as a doctor, hopefully, in the next coming years. But yeah, again, like with the exams and the whole uncertainty with that, I don't even know whether that's going to happen. I don't even know what tomorrow is going to look like, to be honest, because this whole thing has been so sudden, unexpected. And it's been really stressful in that kind of regard. And sorry, I forgot the first question.
The first question was about the project, about the art project, and whether you kind of set out to create something which was going to be seen as a trustworthy source of information.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of our main motives. What we want is to connect with other young people and to help them as much as possible with accurate information, and like to make them also realize that we're all in this together, and that like we all have each other's backs. And it's difficult because a lot of the time that's not possible, because I don't know what I'm saying. But yeah, that is what our plan is. So hopefully we get to do that in the future.
Thank you very much, Alma. Hood, you're still there. You want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Carl for the question. And to answer your first one, I'd like to say that I think that regarding to how we'd communicate with other young people, I just think that like every young person just wants to be heard, and if you give them the opportunity to get their point across, so maybe in group chats, and talk to them and put out the question, you know, what do you think would benefit you and help you in the future, and how what we can do to help you. And I think that just as a whole, it's just students just want to be heard, and young adults just want to be given that platform to get their voice across and just speak how they feel. But yeah.
Thank you, Hood. Noah, did you have any last comments? Are you still there? Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for everybody who's spoken in regards to our comments and our perspectives on how it is affecting our lives. Carl, your questions, within like with how COVID has come across so unexpectedly, none of us could see this coming like at all, and a lot of us are just coming into adulthood. We are only just coming out of being mothered or like kind of protected by parents kind of thing. We've got more leeway, that kind of thing, with how we are. And with COVID, it's kind of wiped that opportunity to become young adults and have the if I don't know whether I'm making any sense or not, but we've kind of not had the opportunity to become young adults and do things like going out partying and that kind of thing, like the normal things that everybody else has, if that makes any sense. and we don't know where we're going to be within a year. As Alma said, we don't know what's going to be coming tomorrow. You know, anything could happen. And I think a lot of us are kind of just living day to day. Okay, we're going to get through this day. We've just got to take tomorrow as it comes. And so I can't actually, a lot of us, I think, can't actually answer where we think we're going to be next year, because it's so uncertain. We thought after the second or like the first lockdown, numbers were coming down for COVID cases, yet look where we are. We're on our third national lockdown and numbers are still quite high. Like, we thought this was just going to be something that we could easily get over as a nation, but it's just not happening. So we can't be sure. We might be still in a lockdown next year. We might not be able to be young adults, if that, like, so we can't actually, we're just living day to day and taking it every day as it comes, because we don't know what's going to be coming, and we've not had much experience in life as other people have. So we're still trying to get our footing in the world. So having this on top of us, it's a massive weight on our shoulders that we don't really know how to cope with. So yeah.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, I think it's incredibly powerful listening to you, and Noah and Hood and Alma all together. I mean, those are incredibly powerful personal experiences of this year, and I think that you feel very acutely what a lot of people feel, which is that we are living in the short term at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to plan for the long term. And we're seeing that what we need are long-term strategies, actually, to help us get out of this. I am going to have to draw this to a close. We could go on much longer today, I feel, but we have limited time. Some people have left us already. So I'm going to invite Sir David King to briefly sum up, if you will, Sir David.
So absolutely, thank you very much, Alice. Very quickly, I normally at this point thank all my colleagues for their wonderful contributions, which have again been wonderful, but I'm just one of those who was very moved and also angry listening to the three young people we've brought forward, amazingly articulate expressions of the position that young people are in at the moment. And I just hope that some television studio is listening to them and will get them on, and they can get a much bigger audience in that way, because they certainly not only deserve it, but it needs to be said by these young people so we can get the message through, not only to the public, but hopefully to the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Thank you for all the questions today. Thank you very much to our special guests, Hood, Alma and Noah, for their powerful contribution. And thank you to everyone watching, whether that's live with us now or catching up. Thank you to our amazing team of experts, all of whom are volunteers, sharing their expertise and listening to your concerns and questions, because they believe that this kind of open communication, this conversation, is vitally important. All of the reports from Independent Sage, including the 2 new ones, are available on the website along with details of the whole team. Please do follow Independent Sage on Twitter if you don't already. We'll be back same time, same place next Friday. Stay home if you can. Stay safe. Keep well. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.